James Morgan was a third-generation cattle rancher whose property sat on the edge of the newly developed Whispering Pines subdivision. Despite the encroaching suburban sprawl, his 80-acre farm had been grandfathered in, exempting him from most HOA regulations. The Morgan family had worked this land since 1891, long before anyone had even dreamed of building cookie-cutter houses with matching mailboxes in this part of the county. On a warm Saturday morning in June, James rose with the sun as he always did. At 52, his body moved a little slower than in his youth, but his daily routine remained unchanged. He pulled on his worn Levi's, a faded blue work shirt, and the scuffed leather boots that had molded perfectly to his feet over the years. The morning air carried the familiar sense of hay, livestock, and the wildflowers that dotted his eastern pasture. After a quick breakfast of black coffee and toast, James headed out to check on his prize bulls before driving into town for supplies. His 4 Spanish fighting bulls were the pride of his operation, especially Thunderbolt, a magnificent beast with a glossy black coat and temperament that matched his name. James had built a reputation for breeding bulls with exceptional genetics, selling to rodeos and specialty breeders across 3 states. As James crossed his property, he noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked along his private access road. A delivery truck with Premier Event Rentals emblazoned on its side was backed up to his renovated barn, a beautiful structure with original beams dating back to 1897. The barn had been lovingly restored 5 years ago, preserving its historical character while reinforcing its structure. James had considered renting it out for events but ultimately decided against inviting strangers onto his working farm. Drawing closer, James heard music and laughter floating through the morning air. The barn doors that he distinctly remembered closing the previous evening now stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling out into the yard where dew still clung to the grass. Confused and increasingly irritated, James approached cautiously. He peered through a gap in the large wooden doors, his weather hands pushing the rough wood just enough to get a clear view inside. What he saw made his jaw clench and his pulse quicken. His barn had been completely transformed. White chairs lined makeshift aisles covered in what appeared to be vintage Persian rugs. Flowers, roses, hydrangeas, and baby's breath adorned every post and rafter. Edison bulbs hung on strings crisscrossing the ceiling, and tall draperies softened the rustic interior. A small crowd of well-dressed people milled about, arranging centerpieces and adjusting a wedding arch positioned exactly where James normally parked his tractor. In the center of this unauthorized transformation stood Gretchen Powell, the notorious HOA president known throughout the county for her overbearing rules and confrontational attitude. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, her slim figure dressed in an expensive-looking pantsuit despite the early hour and manual work happening around her. She was directing workers with imperious hand gestures while speaking animatedly into her phone, clearly orchestrating what appeared to be a wedding setup in his barn without his knowledge or permission. "No, no, no," Gretchen's voice carried across the barn as she berated a young man attempting to hang fairy lights. "Those need to be draped, not strung in straight lines. This is a rustic chic wedding, not a county fair." James felt his face flush with anger as he pushed the door open wider. This was his property, his barn, his livelihood, and someone had invaded it without so much as a courtesy call. When James pushed open the barn doors fully, the buzz of conversation briefly halted. Heads turned, and the workers froze mid-task. Attention fell over the space like a heavy blanket. Gretchen's face registered momentary surprise, a flash of wide eyes and parted lips, before quickly shifting to a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She handed her phone to a nearby assistant and strode purposefully across the barn's wooden floor, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the planks his grandfather had laid over a century ago. "Oh, Mr. Morgan," she called out as if they were old friends, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that set his teeth on edge. "How wonderful you could join us. Your barn is absolutely perfect for my daughter's rustic wedding. The exposed beams, the natural light, it's everything Madison dreamed of." James stood in the doorway, his work-worn hands clenched at his sides, momentarily speechless at the audacity unfolding before him. The workers had resumed their tasks, though more quietly now, casting occasional glances his way. He spotted 3 young women in matching lavender robes, sipping mimosas in the corner, bridesmaids, he assumed, whispering and watching the interaction with undisguised curiosity. Gretchen reached him and placed a manicured hand on his forearm, leaning in as if sharing a confidence. He caught a whiff of expensive perfume as she lowered her voice to a conspiratorial tone. "I know this must seem unexpected," she explained, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child, "but we had the most dreadful emergency. The Silver Creek Lodge flooded yesterday, a broken pipe, can you imagine? With Madison's wedding just hours away, we're absolutely desperate." She waved her hand dramatically. "Then I remembered your lovely barn, sitting unused most of the time, and it seemed like Providence." James found his tongue at last. "Mrs. Powell, this is private property. You can't just—" "Gretchen, please," she interrupted, squeezing his arm. "We're neighbors, after all." With her free hand, she smoothly withdrew a cream-colored envelope from her designer jacket and slipped it into his shirt pocket, her movements practiced and confident. "This rental fee is more than generous for a structure that's just sitting here anyway. Frankly, you should consider yourself fortunate. We've already posted pictures online, and 3 other couples have asked about booking for fall weddings." The presumption knocked the wind from James' lungs. He pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it out to her. "I didn't agree to any of this. You need to pack up and leave. Now." For just a moment, Gretchen's mask slipped. Her smile hardened, the corners of her mouth turning down and her eyes narrowed. She didn't take the envelope. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice dropping to a steel-edged murmur, "I've been more than accommodating. Do you know how many HOA violations your property currently has pending?" 17. "I've been keeping them in administrative review out of courtesy." She stepped closer, no longer touching him, but somehow more threatening in her proximity. "It would be unfortunate if the county suddenly took a keen interest in your zoning exemptions. I understand from Commissioner Wilson that your grandfather's arrangement was predicated on maintaining certain agricultural standards that, frankly, this place hasn't met in years." James felt his face grow hot. "Are you threatening me on my own land?" Gretchen's smile returned, practiced and cold. "I'm offering a mutually beneficial arrangement. Besides," she added with a dismissive wave toward the decorations and the people bustling about, "everything's paid for and the ceremony starts in 3 hours. The photographer will be here any minute and the guests are already getting ready. Surely you wouldn't ruin a bride's special day? What kind of person would that make you in the community's eyes?" James retreated to his house, a century-old farmhouse with wooden siding painted a weathered blue. His boots landed heavily on each step of the back porch as he entered through the kitchen door, slamming it behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. He tossed his hat onto the counter and ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, his breathing still rapid from the confrontation. From the kitchen window, he had a clear view of his barn. Workers continued to arrive, unloading flowers, a small stage for a band, and what appeared to be a 3-tiered wedding cake. James watched, fuming, as Gretchen directed operations like a field general, pointing and issuing commands that carried across the yard despite the distance. He reached for the rotary phone mounted on his wall. He'd never seen the need for anything fancier and dialed the county sheriff's office. After 3 rings, a bored-sounding deputy answered. "This is James Morgan out on County Line Road," he began, explaining the situation as concisely as possible. The deputy's response was less than satisfying. "Sheriff Reynolds is at a conference in the Capitol until Monday," the young man told him. "And to be honest, Mr. Morgan, I'm not entirely sure about the protocols for property disputes of this nature. Technically, it's trespassing, but if she's claiming it was a misunderstanding—" "This is no misunderstanding," James interrupted. "She admitted she never asked permission." "Well, sir, without the sheriff here to make a judgment call, the best I can do is send someone out tomorrow to take statements. We're short-staffed today with the county-wide fishing tournament and all." James hung up after extracting a half-hearted promise that someone would check on the situation as soon as possible, knowing full well that by then the wedding would be long over and the damage done. He paced the worn linoleum of his kitchen floor, occasionally stopping to peer out at the increasing activity around his barn. His cell phone, a basic model he kept mostly for emergencies, buzzed on the counter. There was a text from Ellie Henderson, who owned the farm adjacent to his eastern boundary. "Just got a last-minute invitation to a wedding at your place," the message read. "Never figured you for the event venue type, but happy you're finally joining the modern world. Need to borrow a dress for my daughter, but we'll try to make it. Saving a dance?" Before James could respond, 3 more messages arrived in quick succession from other neighbors, all expressing surprise at receiving invitations to a charming barn wedding at the Morgan property. One even congratulated him on finally deciding to be part of the community instead of the grumpy old holdout. James felt his face flush with renewed anger. It became crystal clear that Gretchen had spun a narrative painting him as an enthusiastic host who had generously offered his barn for her daughter's wedding. She'd effectively backed him into a corner where any objection now would make him appear petty and cruel to the entire community. He tossed the phone onto the counter and walked to his living room window, which offered a different view of his property. From here, he could see the paddock where his bulls were currently grazing. Thunderbolt, the largest of the 4, was pawing at the ground near the fence line, agitated by the unusual activity nearby. The massive black bull had a particular dislike for unfamiliar people and loud noises, a fact James had learned to respect over the years. As he watched the powerful animal's restless movements, a thought began to form in James' mind. His gaze shifted between the barn preparations and his bulls, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face. He wasn't a vengeful man by nature, But Gretchen's entitlement and manipulation had pushed him past reasonable patience. "You want a rustic farm experience," he muttered to himself, "then you'll get the full package." James retrieved a notebook from his desk drawer and sat at his kitchen table, sketching a rough map of his property. He began plotting access routes and timing, formulating a plan not to harm anyone, but to reclaim his property and teach Gretchen a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. By mid-afternoon, the June sun hung high in a cloudless sky, casting dappled shadows through the ancient oak trees surrounding James' property. Cars lined his gravel driveway and spilled onto the county road. Luxury sedans and SUVs with gleaming paint jobs that stood in stark contrast to his mud-splattered pickup truck. Guests in formal attire picked their way carefully across the farmyard, the women balancing precariously in high heels clearly not designed for agricultural terrain. James observed it all from the shade of his back porch, dressed now in clean jeans and a pressed shirt, not out of respect for the occasion, but to blend in once his plan was set in motion. Through a pair of binoculars normally used for checking fence lines, he watched as a vintage Rolls-Royce with white ribbons streaming from its antenna rolled to a stop before the barn. From the passenger side emerged Madison Powell, Gretchen's daughter, resplendent in a lace wedding gown that caught the afternoon light. Despite his anger at the situation, James felt a twinge of sympathy for the young woman. With her nervous smile and the way she clutched her father's arm as they approached the barn, she seemed genuinely excited about her wedding day. James wondered briefly if she had any idea that her venue had been commandeered without permission. "Not her fault her mother's a tyrant," he muttered to himself, lowering the binoculars. For a moment, he considered abandoning his plan. Then he caught sight of Gretchen emerging from the barn to greet her daughter, her face arranged in a look of maternal pride that seemed as calculated as everything else about her. His resolve hardened once more. At precisely 4 o'clock, violin music drifted across the property. Through the barn's wide-open doors, James could see the ceremony beginning. Madison floated down the aisle on her father's arm while Gretchen dabbed theatrically at her eyes with a monogram handkerchief. The assembled guests, at least 60 by James' count, rose to their feet as the bride approached a flower-covered arch where her groom waited. The ceremony was mercifully brief. Within 20 minutes, cheers erupted from the barn, followed by the upbeat tempo of a live band starting to play. The reception had begun, and with it, the final countdown to James' reclamation of his property. By 5:30, the party was in full swing. From his strategic position behind a stand of trees near the barn's northern side, James watched as servers circulated with trays of champagne and appetizers. A 3-tiered wedding cake stood proudly near the barn's eastern wall, its white fondant decorated with sugar flowers that matched the real blooms adorning the tables. A photographer darted through the crowd, capturing candid moments of guests laughing and dancing. Gretchen held court near the makeshift bar, a glass of champagne in hand, laughing and accepting compliments on her vision for the perfect country wedding. Several times, James heard her explain to admiring guests how she had partnered with our local farmer to create this authentic rustic experience. Each lie twisted the knife deeper. It was during the father-daughter dance that James decided to make his move. The band had slowed to a tender ballad, and Madison was circling the cleared dance floor in her father's arms, her expression one of pure joy. Guests gathered around, snapping photos and wiping away sentimental tears. James slipped away, circling back toward his house and the paddock beyond. He'd spent the afternoon carefully calculating how to create maximum disruption with minimum risk. The timing needed to be perfect, late enough that the wedding itself would be completed, but early enough that the message would be unmistakable. He wasn't out to ruin young woman's entire wedding day or to physically harm anyone, just to send a crystal-clear message about trespassing and entitlement. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across his land, James reached the bull paddock. Thunderbolt raised his massive head, dark eyes fixing on his owner with what almost seemed like understanding. "Time to earn your keep, old boy," James said softly, unlatching the first gate. As twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, James worked quickly and methodically. First, he opened the gate, separating his bull's pasture from the fenced pathway that normally guided the animals to the eastern field for rotation grazing. Thunderbolt, sensing the unusual evening activity, snorted and pawed at the ground, his massive shoulder muscles rippling beneath his glossy black hide. The other 3 bulls, Diablo, Tornado, and Bruiser, followed their leader with typical bovine curiosity. Using a mixture of soft whistles and gentle prods from a familiar cattle prod, James herded the animals along the corridor that led directly to the barn's rear entrance. Years of working with these powerful creatures had taught him their behaviors and triggers. They weren't wild or unmanageable, just predictable in their responses to stimuli. And right now, James was counting on those predictable responses. "Easy now, boys," he murmured as he positioned them near the back door that had been propped open for ventilation. The bulls were now just 15 yards from the reception, separated only by a single gate that James had intentionally left unlatched. From inside the barn, music and laughter grew louder as the celebration reached its peak. Through the gap, James could see the flashing lights of the dance floor and guests moving rhythmically to an upbeat song. Timing was everything now. He retreated to a safe distance, taking cover behind his tractor shed, where he had a clear view of both the bulls and the barn's interior through the open doors. From his pocket, he retrieved a small remote control, part of the farm's emergency system installed after a worker had been injured alone in a far field 3 years ago. James drew a deep breath, his finger hovering over the button. He wasn't a malicious man by nature, but Gretchen's entitled takeover of his property and her subsequent threats had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He pressed the button. Immediately, the piercing wail of the farm's emergency alarm cut through the evening air. The sound, designed to carry across the full 80 acres, sliced through the music and revelry like a knife. Inside the barn, the music stuttered momentarily as the DJ was startled by the noise, but it was the bull's reaction that mattered. As James had anticipated, the sudden, unfamiliar siren sent the animals into an immediate state of agitation. Thunderbolt bellowed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. He tossed his massive head, eyes rolling as the continued alarm assaulted his sensitive ears. With a snort and another bellow, he charged forward, pushing through the unlatched gate with the force of a battering ram. The other bulls, following their alpha's lead, thundered after him. Just as planned, they charged toward the only open space available to them, straight into the barn through the back entrance. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. A woman in a silver cocktail dress was the first to spot the intruders. Her scream pierced the air high and sharp above the siren that continued to wail. "Bulls, there are bulls in here." Panic erupted as nearly 70 wedding guests suddenly realized they were sharing space with 4 agitated, 1,000-pound Spanish fighting bulls. People scrambled in all directions, seeking higher ground. Some leaped on the tables, others climbed hay bales that had been arranged as rustic seating. One elderly man in a tuxedo demonstrated surprising agility as he scaled a decorative ladder to reach the barn's loft. Gretchen's perfectly arranged centerpieces went flying as Diablo, the youngest bull, swung his head across a table, sending glassware shattering across the wooden floor. The wedding cake toppled as tornado brushed against the table supporting it, sending tears of white fondant cascading down in a sugary avalanche. The DJ's equipment squealed with feedback as its operator abandoned his post, diving behind his table for cover. Through it all, James calmly walked through the front entrance of the barn, lockbox key in hand, playing the role of the concerned property owner responding to an emergency on his land. He wore an expression of practiced surprise as he surveyed the chaos, watching as Thunderbolt claimed the center of the dance floor, pawing at the ground and snorting at the terrified guests huddled against the walls. Within 30 minutes, James had skillfully herded his bulls back to their pasture. Years of working with livestock had given him an almost telepathic connection with the animals, and with a series of whistles, gentle commands, and strategic movements, he guided them away from the stunned wedding guests and out through the back entrance. To any observer, it appeared he had salvaged a dangerous situation rather than orchestrated it. The wedding, however, was effectively over. The beautiful barn that had hosted Madison Powell's dream rustic ceremony now stood in disarray, centerpieces trampled, flowers scattered, cake destroyed, and most notably, a lingering bovine scent that no amount of floral air freshener could mask. Outside, guests huddled in groups by their cars, shooting nervous glances toward the barn as if expecting another bull stampede at any moment. Some had already departed, tires spitting gravel as they fled the farm. Others lingered, the drama proving too enticing to leave just yet. Smartphones had captured the entire incident, and James had no doubt that by morning, the wedding bull catastrophe would be trending on local social media. Madison sat on a hay bale near the barn entrance, her once perfect wedding gown now smudged with dirt and what appeared to be a hoof print across its train. Her makeup had run in streaks down her cheeks, but as James approached, he noticed her tears seemed to stem from more than just the disruption. "I'm so sorry about your wedding," James said, genuine sympathy in his voice. Despite everything, he hadn't wanted to hurt the young woman. Madison looked up, her expression surprisingly composed. "My mother didn't actually have permission to use your barn, did she?" When James hesitated, she nodded grimly. "I thought so." She kept avoiding my questions about the rental agreement. She twisted her new wedding ring nervously. "I wanted a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens, but Mom insisted on taking over. She always does." Before James could respond, Gretchen stormed over, her designer dress now splattered with mud and wedding cake. A lopsided floral arrangement clung precariously to her once perfect updo, giving her the appearance of a deranged garden statue. "You," she spat, jabbing a manicured finger at James's chest. "This was deliberate. You'll be hearing from my attorney first thing Monday morning." Destruction of property, endangerment of guests, emotional distress. I'll own this worthless farm by the end of the month. Several guests had gathered to watch the confrontation, including Madison's new husband, who placed a protective arm around his bride's shoulders. With remarkable calm, James pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Gretchen's own voice filled the evening air. I've been keeping them in administrative review out of courtesy. It would be unfortunate if the county suddenly took a keen interest in your zoning exemptions.